Hello and welcome to the Daily Aus. I'm Sam Koslowski.
I'm Emma Gillespie.
Jimmy Kimmel's late night show has been pulled off the air for the foreseeable future after the host made comments about political reactions to the killing of Charlie Kirk. The move by Disney, which owns ABC, came after a major TV station owner said it would drop the show and the head of the US communications regulator threatened regulatory action. Today, we're going to unpack what Kimmel said on air, why it's caused such a major response, and what this all means for media regulation in the US.
Sam, I'm so excited to dive into this topic today. It's been a really big couple of months for this late night space, for the kind of politics of comedy and US television programming. So much to chat through. But before we get into this latest controversy, can you give us a quick rundown on Jimmy Kimmel? He's not the only Jimmy, so I think it would be helpful to help our audience understand a little more about him. He's been around for a long time.
He absolutely has. He has hosted Jimmy Kimmel Live, his show on ABC, since 2003.
ABC America, of course.
Yeah.
Yep.
And so he's in his 22nd year of hosting that show.
Wow.
Which in the world of comedy, but in almost any gig, that is a long time.
Yeah.
You're right. There's more than one Jimmy. There's Jimmy Fallon. He hosts The Tonight Show. And together with Stephen Colbert, Seth Meyers, John Oliver, there's a bit of a gang of late night talk show hosts in the US. Now, one important bit of context before we dive into Kimmel's show on Monday night is that generally a late night show has two parts to it. It's got an opening monologue, which is when the host stands up in front of the audience and kind of gives their take on the day of news and current affairs.
It's a bit like a stand-up set meets pop culture and news.
Exactly. And sometimes it does take a serious tone, especially if there's serious things to talk about. The rest of the show is normally celebrity interviews and a bit of comedy.
Yeah, which I think is interesting context because obviously these shows are so tied into the fabric of US TV culture. But of course, here in Australia, we don't really have anything like them. What exactly did Jimmy Kimmel say this week that's caused this massive response?
So he gets up on Monday night, so it would have aired Tuesday, middle of the day here in Australia, and Jimmy Kimmel commented on the killing of Charlie Kirk and the political reactions to it. He said this.
We hit some new lows over the weekend with the MAGA gang desperately trying to characterize this kid who murdered Charlie Kirk as anything other than one of them and doing everything they can to score political points from it.
He also mocked President Trump's response to Kirk's death, particularly Trump discussing White House ballroom construction when asked about it. Kimmel said, "This is not how an adult grieves the murder of somebody he called a friend. This is how a 4-year-old mourns a goldfish."
Now, Charlie Kirk, of course, who is the US conservative political activist who was shot dead at that speaking event at a Utah university last week.
Yeah.
To Kimmel's comments, though, a key part of understanding the political response and the fallout around it is the way in which political ideology, the left versus the right, and particularly the suspect's political ideology has become a point of focus.
Yeah, so this suspect, 22-year-old Tyler Robinson, he was arrested after turning himself into authorities, and we've learnt a bit more about his motivation and what prosecutors are alleging led to him allegedly assassinating Charlie Kirk. He has some text messages to his roommate saying, "I had enough of his hatred," referring to Kirk. "Some hate can't be negotiated out." And of course, prosecutors are seeking the death penalty in this case. Now, Utah's governor said Robinson had, quote, leftist ideology. And we've heard similar comments from President Trump, Vice President J.D. Vance, and almost every other major figure in the Trump White House about how the political action that they need to deliver in response to Kirk's killing is going to look like a crackdown on what they categorize as extremist left-wing groups and inflammatory left-wing language. And that was the approach that Kimmel was then criticizing on his show.
Okay, so Kimmel's comments weren't necessarily about celebrating Charlie Kirk's death. He was more pointing to a political conversation, the approach that the Trump administration is taking, and criticizing that as potentially unfair or censorship.
Exactly. It's really important, actually, and to highlight what you just said, it wasn't really about the act of Charlie Kirk being killed itself at all. It was about what's happening now.
Okay. And I think it's probably an understatement to say that this assassination and the social media narrative post Charlie Kirk's death has become such a hotly debated issue in the US. We know people are losing their jobs over social media comments. Even here in Australia, South Australia police are investigating someone for their comments. So that's helpful context to understand, why this is so charged. But Sam, my question, I suppose, about Jimmy Kimmel specifically is that late night hosts criticize politicians all the time. It's part and parcel of the job. These guys are professional comedians and broadcasters. They engage in satirical conversations and skits all the time. So what made this different?
Well, I think to really answer that, we need to look to the FCC. So the FCC, that's the Federal Communications Commission.
So this is like the US communications watchdog?
Yeah, kind of. It's got a different structure and a different role in the US than a communications watchdog here.
Right.
The FCC is the government agency that actually regulates television and radio, not just from the content, but also from the hardware. So to own a signal, whether that be a TV signal or a radio signal in the US, the FCC grants you a license.
Okay.
So it's almost, think about it as like those television towers are public assets, and the FCC lends them out to TV networks.
Got it.
And so the chair of that body is a guy called Brendan Carr, who is a really close ally of President Trump. He was installed by Trump. He was on a podcast on Wednesday, and in that podcast, he was asked about Kimmel's comments on his show, and he said that Kimmel's comments were some of the sickest conduct possible. But more importantly, he made what sounded like direct threats against the networks themselves.
Right.
So he said it was, quote, a very, very serious issue right now for Disney, which is the parent company of ABC, and that we can do this the easy way or the hard way. He told the networks they could, quote, find ways to change conduct and take actions on Kimmel, or there's going to be additional work for the FCC ahead.
That is some very strong language to foreshadow what we know unfolded. How much power does the FCC actually have, though? How significant are those remarks?
Hi, I'm Zara. I'm the co-founder of the Daily Aus, and we started this company because we think news can be done differently. If you agree, you can hit subscribe. It's the best way to help us grow. Now, back to the video.
Well, again, it's about the ownership of those licenses, and the FCC does have the power to suspend networks if they believe they're not operating in, quote, the public interest. That power hasn't been used by the FCC really in its history, definitely not against a mainstream broadcaster.
Okay.
The other thing that the FCC does, and definitely put a mental pin in this, is the FCC is the body that approves any mergers of media companies or any sales of media companies. So those two powers are really key to this story. And in the interview on Wednesday on the podcast, Carr delivered a message to broadcasters. He said, you have a license granted by us at the FCC, and that comes with it an obligation to operate in the public interest.
It's interesting to hear a regulator like this intervening or speaking in that manner. It's not as unusual maybe for network bosses to have their say over what goes on their stations, but this kind of more top line regulator, it's interesting and unusual, definitely different to how things work here in Australia. But that then brings us to the station's response. How did it interpret, what Carr had said?
So we've got the main character in the story from a network perspective of ABC. They're owned by Disney. I'm introducing now another character. This network is called Nexstar. Okay. And Nexstar is the largest television station owner in the US. It operates more than 200 stations.
200?
Yeah, a
Never
lot.
Heard of it. Seriously?
Yeah. Well, I mean, a lot of these stations are state specific. So 32 of their 200 are ABC affiliated stations. So think like ABC New Mexico.
Got it.
Or ABC Nevada. And those stations will program a whole bunch of local content. So you might have a morning television show that's very locally relevant.
Yep.
And then they'll jump on some of the content made by some of the biggest names in the network, like Jimmy Kimmel, and program that at peak hour times at night, for example. And so they broadcast Jimmy Kimmel's show on 32 of those 200 stations. Carr delivers those threats on a podcast. Nexstar immediately announces it would pull Kimmel's show immediately. The company said the comments were, quote, offensive and insensitive and do not reflect the spectrum of opinions, views, or values of the local communities they serve.
So an immediate reaction to the FCC's comments.
Yeah, and they released these comments in the form of a very official corporate statement. And they didn't stop there. The head of the network said that continuing to air Jimmy Kimmel's show is simply not in the public interest at the current time, and that they needed to suspend the show in order to let cooler heads prevail. Now, remember what I said before about the FCC and the mergers and sales powers?
Yes.
There is another element to Nexstar to know about, and that is that they are waiting on FCC approval for a major business deal. And that business deal is a merger with another one of these absolutely enormous TV companies we've never heard of.
Okay.
So when the FCC chair makes a threat on radio, companies like Nexstar do get placed in a very, very vulnerable position.
It's got a lot of the hallmarks of a very similar late night show, network, merger, host sacking
we're gonna
get into. Yeah. But I want to keep talking about Nexstar while this is all fresh in our minds. So this is a network that distributes Kimmel's show. It suspends the broadcast of the Jimmy Kimmel show, and then the ABC decides to suspend the show entirely. How do we go from just pulling the show off the air for one day versus like an actual bigger suspension?
Well, they're calling it an indefinite suspension.
Right.
So we don't know.
So it's not cancelled.
It's not cancelled, but there's definitely no indication as to when it is going to return, or at least not at the time of recording. They've used a word in the statement of that the show has been preempted indefinitely. And in broadcasting, preempted means a show is being pulled because of something unforeseen. So let's say that there's a terror attack. They might pull an episode of a sitcom and instead put the news in its place.
Yeah.
And that's the term that they're using now to describe where the situation with Jimmy Kimmel is at. But there's definitely no line in their statement, a very short 7-word statement about, it's taking a day off and it will return next week.
Okay. And how did the FCC then react to that suspension?
Well, that FCC chair, Brendan Carr, he took to X, formerly Twitter, and he said, I want to thank Nexstar for doing the right thing. Local broadcasters have an obligation to serve the public interest. And you can then pick up that he's using a phrase that's in the charter of the FCC, and you can begin to kind of put things together. He said, while this may be an unprecedented decision, it is important for broadcasters to push back on Disney programming that they determine falls short of community values. I hope that other broadcasters follow Nexstar's lead. Then we heard from the president, Donald Trump. He called Kimmel's suspension, quote, great news for America, saying Kimmel has zero talent and worse ratings than even Colbert, that's Stephen Colbert, if that's possible. Then he said that leaves Jimmy Fallon and Seth Meyers, 2 total losers on fake news NBC, and he called on NBC to cancel both of those shows.
Okay, but we know that Donald Trump has a long-term loathing, I think, for late night hosts because these are the comedians that do make fun of his policies and have, especially in recent years, made no real effort to kind of conceal their distaste for Donald Trump as a politician. What about Jimmy Kimmel himself? Have we heard from him?
At the time of recording, we haven't. So we haven't heard any more from ABC/Disney on their decision and what motivated that decision. But no, we haven't heard any more from Kimmel or his representatives.
Okay. I'm sure we will see a pattern of, celebrities and other late night hosts coming out in solidarity with him because we have a previous example to draw on. That's how things unfolded when it was announced that Stephen Colbert was being cancelled. Talk to me about that show and the relationship between late night TV hosts and American politics.
Well, Stephen Colbert was on the air for 10 years with The Late Show with Stephen Colbert on CBS. And think about these timelines. I mean, we've got 23 years for Kimmel. We've got 10 years for Colbert. These are very well-entrenched stars of late night television.
On national free-to-air broadcasters.
Very influential shows, especially now having found new audiences on YouTube as well. That's something else to consider. So in July, CBS cancelled The Late Show with Stephen Colbert just 3 days after Colbert criticized a settlement reached by Paramount with Trump. Paramount owns CBS. Trump was suing the network for airing commentary about a civil case where Trump was found liable for sexual abuse. CBS ended up settling that case with Trump for $16 million US. Now, at the time of Colbert's cancellation, CBS called it a purely financial decision, and that's relating to the demise of late-night television, changing viewership numbers, advertisers not as attracted to the products, and that's all true. But it is also worth noting that Paramount is also currently awaiting FCC approval for its own merger. That's with Skydance Media, and that's a multi-billion-dollar merger.
Yeah, we've heard a lot about that deal. It is incredibly financially valuable, and there was a lot of criticism at the time about the relationship between that merger and the decision about Colbert. Colbert, who of course won an Emmy this week. I think it's probably a good time to play a little bit of a moment from his speech, which speaks to this kind of broader conversation.
Sometimes you only truly know how much you love something when you get a sense that you might be losing it. And 10 years later, in September of 2025, my friends, I have never loved my country more desperately. God bless America. Stay strong, be brave, and if the elevator tries to bring you down, go crazy and punch a higher floor. Woo!
Sam, this might be a hard question to answer, and I know there's a lot at play in the current political climate, but is this the new normal for US media? Is this a new kind of relationship between politics and television?
It's entirely new. I mean, we haven't seen the wave of civil actions by the President of the United States against major news outlets. I mean, think about even this week, a $15 billion lawsuit launched by President Trump against the New York Times.
Yeah.
A couple of weeks ago, it was an action against the Wall Street Journal and News Corp. This is a staggering pace of civil action. It is also unprecedented that we're seeing this type of language being used against political commentary in the comedy space. And that's a big point here. I mean, the White House hosts an event every year where they actually invite a comedian to come and roast the President of the United States, the White House Correspondents' Dinner. So it's inbuilt into the kind of political psyche that comedians should be allowed to commentate. And this is changing quite quickly. The other thing to note is the changing role of the FCC. So the FCC historically, the chair of the FCC isn't somebody that we would hear from. It was a pretty boring job. It was kind of to make sure that TV stations covered all parts of the country and that people weren't getting ripped off with dial-up internet, all that kind of thing. It wasn't a political position, but now it's really become a political instrument. There's actually a new kind of group that's formed of former FCC chairs and commissioners. They put out a statement recently that warned that the agency now risks functioning as, quote, the White House's personal censor.
Yeah, that word censorship has been thrown around a lot in the last few months, but I don't think this conversation is going away, and I'm sure we're going to hear even more on this in the days and weeks to come as we wait to hear and learn more about Jimmy Kimmel's fate. Definitely,
and as we can see from Stephen Colbert and his appearance at the Emmys, these stars tend to not go quietly. So We'll see what happens next.
So interesting. Thank you for unpacking that for us today, Sam.
Thanks, Em.
And thank you for listening to today's episode. That's all for today's deep dive, but we will be back a little later on with your afternoon news headlines. Until then, have a good day.